Yeah.
It's Lord Jim O'Neill I'm speaking to, chairman of Chatham House, amongst many other things, distinguished economist and commentator on world events. And we're here talking about the consequences of COVID-19 on this call with the Asia Scotland Institute. And Jim, I'd just like to start, because there's been a lot about this in the press recently. You are uniquely, if you like, positioned, because not only do you know a lot about economics, but you're also someone who had been talking about the need to address healthcare issues some time ago with your work on antimicrobial issues.
Yeah.
Now, why don't we start off talking about where the economic facts meet with the healthcare challenges?
So I guess well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure. I guess the first thing to say in response to that, in a way, it's sort of stating the obvious, but it's only because of this crisis that it now seems obvious, is that you cannot separate health systems from finance. One of the crucial reasons why I was asked by David Cameron to lead an independent review into antimicrobial resistance, looking at it globally back in 2014, was because somebody in David's orbit rather presciently now, even more so now, realized that unless you took a health issue to people in the world of business and finance, nothing would probably happen. And whilst our review had an enormous amount of attention, what it also now highlights to me, many years later, is another issue that I guess many of us have learned through life, is that there's a difference between talk and execution. And I think amongst the many, many aspects of where we're starting this discussion, I would imagine this is going to give enormous pause for reflection from senior British civil servants. Because linked to my review, since 2015, antimicrobial resistance and the threat of pandemics have been a major highlighted feature in the annual National Risk Register for the UK, which highlighted Britain's at least thinking about the global consequences of these issues, but as we know, sadly, hasn't actually helped us any better than many other countries in combating it when it becomes real. Trying to link it all together, to come back to where you first started, I think this will now demonstrate that the world has to spend more, however difficult it is, on its preventive health systems. And so that whenever the next infectious disease comes, a lot of us are so much better prepared than we have been for this one.
And Jim, you were doing this in 2014, you said, and of course then Bill Gates.
From 2014 to 2016.
Yeah, and then Bill Gates, I think in 2015, was picking up this theme, as you know, saying that we were paying more attention to the possibility of nuclear war than we were to something fundamentally much more dangerous. As you were doing this here in the UK, what was going on in the US? Were there people similarly looking at this area with you?
I often have said it's the most interesting professional thing I've ever done, actually. And there were so many different reasons why I thought and still think that. And one of which is the very narrow field or group of people that thought seriously about it. And linked to that, one of the reasons why it was so interesting is because I was learning so much. I traveled around the world, spoke to many leading thinkers about it, and because of my background, a number of economic policymakers. And in the States, there were certainly a number of leading health research institutions thinking about it. But again, as I found elsewhere, if I tried to talk to the US Treasury or people at the International Monetary Fund for that matter about it, they didn't really want to talk to me about it, and directed me to people in the Department of Health in the States or to health research institutes. But there was definitely some research thinking going on about it. And I might say that linked to some of the proposals we had, if we would have had a different outcome of the 2016 presidential election, I think there might have been more initiatives on policies certainly related to antimicrobial resistance than we've seen.
Right. Doug, did you want to comment on your conversation you had recently with Taiwan?
Yeah, well, only really, it just bears out the significance of what you said, Jim. I mean, both Taiwan and Singapore I've been talking to recently, and it seems to me that they were very, very aware of the situation from SARS, and they were much better protected because of how significant that had been upon them. And so it really just bears out what you said, I think. But you may have some personal experience of those countries.
So what I would say about those two countries and a number of others, which brings to another parallel that relates to economic policies and economic developments. During my days as chief economist for Goldman Sachs, many moons ago, I presided over the creation of something we called a growth environment index, which included a significant number of variables that we use to try and gauge the quality and sustainability of countries' growth. And we did it for over 180 countries. And the higher countries are on that index seems to also coincide with countries that not only have generally higher levels of wealth, but also more equally distributed wealth than many others. And what is so interesting during this crisis is that of the top 10 countries on the last time that index was calculated in 2014, 8 of them are the best performing countries in terms of the small number of deaths relative to their population size during COVID-19. And it includes the countries you would expect from Asia. So Taiwan wasn't on that index, but I'm sure if it was, it would have been. But certainly Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and in Europe, surprise, surprise, Scandinavian countries, and each of New Zealand and Australia too. And the coincidence is not a surprise. And the countries that have been troubled in the Western world, the United Kingdom included, but a lot of the warmer Mediterranean countries in the United States, they do not appear in the top 10 of that group. And I don't think it's a coincidence. The other thing to throw in, which I think is of great relevance, given the timing in which we have this chat, ahead of a number of countries approaching, let's call it the second phase of the fight against COVID, where they're starting to reduce such blunt social distancing, and the UK is thinking about it. One of the things that so many of those countries do so well is the widespread use of technology. And again, as I think we've seen in this crisis, in the Anglo-Saxon world, yes, we have a lot of technological innovation, but its use and availability is not broadly spread across our country's populations. And that also massively distinguishes us in a less flattering way than the likes of Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong and South Korea and so on.
Is this an issue, Jim, to do with people's sense of their liberty? I remember all the arguments about seatbelts and helmets on motorbikes and things. Is it because people think that the state is going to monitor what you're doing? And that's the concern in China, isn't it? In this whole test and track thing, which I'm delighted to see that Michael Bloomberg's got together with Governor Cuomo in the tri-state area to put money behind that. Is that the thing? Is that people don't like being checked up on? Do you think? Is it a psychological thing?
Well, I think there may be an element of that, but I think it's more substantively basic, Roddy. I think and it might be more broadly reflected of what people describe as the just-in-time inventory-led economy, is that governments in many of the so-called advanced countries, and it's noticeable, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon economies, particularly the US and the UK, we have not thought about truly ensuring the availability of technology for all our people, whether that be 4 or 5G mobile signal, whether it's the availability of laptops and computers. A major problem the UK is facing right now with schools being shut down is the whole issue of online education for the most disadvantaged people. There are tens of thousands of kids from poor backgrounds that I gather are simply not getting access to any online education because they don't have the tools that you and I are using right here this minute. Yeah. And I think it's playing out in the health space. And we need to urgently deal with that, because another consequence of this crisis is, of course, the role of technology in health prevention and prescription is probably permanently boosted. And in that regard, really good thing is that we happen to have currently a health minister in the UK that is very eager about the role of technology.
Yeah, that's great. Let's ask you another question, which has to do with the extent to which leading politicians are aligned with the experts whose advice they draw on. It appears that in Germany, Angela Merkel has got a very good relationship with the health professionals. It looks as if in the UK it's reasonably good, but there's been this extraordinary thing since you and I last spoke about the President of the United States suggesting that you ingest the equivalent of Dettol and things, and yet his advisors stand by and are reluctant to publicly countermand that. Can you explain that?
You know, some days I wake up being cheered by the farcical nature of how certain aspects of this are playing out with the US President, and there are other days where I wake up depressed. And it is quite remarkable that we go through this staggering crisis with such an odd person as the leader of the free world. And what is exhibited by his remarkable comments last week, and the intimidatory feel that a lot of senior health people obviously feel stood within 5 meters of him is so disappointing. But this is you know, the most successful large country of our generation and beyond, showing very, very little signs of genuine leadership of the free world. And linked to what we were talking about before, and now this does delve into where I am really disappointed. Whatever the inadequacies of the WHO, and they are some, Trump's opposition to the role of the WHO, particularly as it relates to China, is actually stopping aspects of international health coordination right now through the so-called G20, the group of the leading 20 nations in the world. And it's something I've been heavily involved in trying to help the past 4 weeks. And a lot of the efforts of people like myself, but much more importantly, people in CEPI and Gavi and the Global Fund and other development agencies that are trying to work on very complex things to do with equitable distribution of treatments, and if we ever get one, vaccines, is basically being halted by the stance of Trump and those that he is listening to, if anybody. It's very disappointing.
Yeah, maybe Rush Limbaugh or something is giving advice on what to do with Lysol. I don't know. In terms of progress with research, there's news coming out of Oxford, isn't there, of progress with something? Is that sound? And is there progress being made in certain?
I think the Oxford one is is one of the most encouraging, linked to what I talked about for my G20 involvement and discussions with the true leading expert health thinkers in the world.
Yes.
Of over 100 initiatives to try and create a vaccine, I gather there are 8 which are particularly encouraging, and Oxford is definitely one of those, and is getting accelerated funding to try and speed up as much as possible, getting this to the final stage of being something to help solve this mess. I haven't spoken to people around that in the past few days, but I have done quite a bit the past month, and I think they have genuine hope of being at the core of this ultimate solution. It's very good.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, excellent. Doug, have you got a couple of questions, and then we can start to wrap up? Jim's been very generous with his time.
Well, perhaps just following up on that last point, Jim, where you talk about the sort of lack of global cooperation in terms of medical situation, but perhaps you could just elaborate on that in terms of the impact on the economy and what prospects you see for the future.
So talking more broadly about international cooperation or the lack of it, of course it's in marked contrast to 2008, which is when the G20 came into real life. And of course, it was in the sort of folklore. Our own then brief Prime Minister Gordon Brown is associated with presiding over the G20 meeting that did all the heavy lifting. As important as Gordon's role on that was, it was actually the then US President George Bush in 2008 that actually brought the G20 into life. And that is obviously important in this regard in health cooperation, but it's even more important in economic cooperation. And just as it's limited as in health, the G20 has failed to agree to try and provide more resources to the IMF. And as and when, if this does spread to the same devastating scale it's done in Europe to the whole of the emerging world, the IMF is going to need more resources. And it's very potentially worrying that we're in this situation. What I would say is a remarkable act of God so far, because I can't think of who it must be an act of otherwise, but as discussed in the media the past 24 hours, including the Financial Times today, which is the 28th of April, very interestingly, there are no signs of COVID-19 actually taking off dramatically so far in Africa, which is contrary to what a lot of people believed as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, but what a lot of people did think back in January. So that would be an enormous relief if in fact, for whatever reason, this has been particularly bad for the temperate world and as well as for some others. In terms of the follow-on implied question about the economic challenges, to be honest with you guys, I'm very torn about it today. Linked to what I just said, and if you reflect back over life since the start of January, and Roddy, last time we chatted, I mentioned this. You were sitting in the audience when we had the US Treasury Secretary at a Chatham House event towards late April. And then it was regarded as primarily a Chinese issue. There was hardly any discussion about it at all at that event till I raised it. And the strong presumption is that both equity markets and the world economy would have a classic V-shaped pattern as we saw through SARS. What is so intriguing is because of how it's devastated Italy, Spain, and caused so much trouble elsewhere in Europe and the States, people have completely abandoned the idea of a V-shaped recovery and now think that, that the whole of our future economic growth is up for doubt forever. And the truth of the matter is we do not know which way this will go. But I would not dismiss as fanciful as many might think it be, that we do end up with some kind of V-shaped recovery. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that much of the economic weakness is because our governments have forced our economies to close down. And if we can exit from this brutal, blunt social distancing with the use of testing and tracing and behave more like the South Koreans and not so much like the Mediterranean countries, and I say that about Italy and Spain as well, then who knows? We might have all become, because of the nature of us beasts as humans, far too pessimistic about how long this will go on for. And of course, ultimately, it goes back to the question about Oxford University and others with a vaccine. If these guys can find and mass produce a vaccine by September, then I would imagine by the fourth quarter of this year, the world economy will be booming, because all that pent up desire for getting into a pub or a restaurant or on a plane or a cruise ship will be saturated by any of us who've got a little bit of money left. So it remains to be seen, and it depends how well we navigate the unlocking of our societies in the next few weeks, as well as the search for a vaccine, in my view.
Jim, thank you. Well, I'm very grateful to you for having given up the time to talk to us this morning. I shall go, and I haven't yet got my FT for today, so I shall go down the road and buy that. I'm allowed to do that, I think. And your comments are hugely informative. And as always, you bring together, as I said, the economic issues and the healthcare challenges that you, for one, certainly have been talking about for a very long time. And people should pay more attention to what's going on, the sort of the unseen enemy, if you like, of society, for which we've been so ill prepared. So leaving you with your wellies and your umbrella, if it's still raining down there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thank you very much, guys. Nice to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.